The sun set low over the sprawling plantation in Alabama, casting long shadows over the fields of tobacco and cotton. The Harrington estate, a towering symbol of wealth and aristocracy, sat at the top of the hill, its grandeur almost mocking the suffering that fueled it. The rhythmic sound of the whip echoed across the land, a reminder that the world was firmly divided between the masters who held the power and the slaves who bore the weight of it. Thomas Harrington, Jr., the only son of the master, stood at the edge of the vast estate, watching the workers toil beneath the fading light. His father, Thomas Sr., had raised him to inherit the plantation, to lead with strength and authority. He had been groomed to rule, to marry well, and to ensure the Harrington name continued its legacy of wealth and dominance. But Thomas Jr. felt a gnawing emptiness in the pit of his stomach, a void that his inheritance, his privilege, could never fill. It was in the midst of this wealth, this world of endless comfort, that Thomas Jr. found her, Clara. She was a young woman who had been enslaved on the Harrington plantation since her childhood, her beauty and strength evident in every graceful movement. Though they were separated by the walls of power and race, their worlds collided in a way that neither could have predicted. Their love was impossible, unspoken, and forbidden. It was a love born in the shadows, where every stolen moment was a defiance of the world they had been born into. For Thomas Jr., the choice between family and love was clear, even if it meant betraying everything he had known, everything he had been taught. Clara was more than a slave to him. She was a woman deserving of love, of freedom, of everything the world had denied her. But the price of their love would be steep. And for Thomas Jr., it would mean not only the loss of his family's fortune, but his very place in the world. Before we move forward into this forbidden love story, I want to know where you're watching from. What time is it there? And how far would you go for love in a world that seeks to keep you apart? Drop a comment below. And if you're drawn to stories of defiance, passion, and the ultimate price of love, hit subscribe. What you're about to hear is a story that could break the chains of history. The day began like any other on the Harrington estate, the rhythmic click of Margaret's heels echoing on the polished floors of the mansion. The house staff moved like shadows in the halls, and the overseers cracked their whips, keeping the enslaved workers in line. It was a world that ran on the suffering of those bound to it. And every soul on the plantation knew their place. Thomas Jr., the only son of Thomas Sr., had spent his life in this world, groomed to inherit the estate, taught to lead with strength and authority. He had been raised to marry into another powerful family, to secure his position as master of the land, and to continue the family legacy. But over the years, the weight of that legacy had begun to feel like a cage. His father's expectations loomed large over him, as did the societal expectations of a world that valued wealth, power, and lineage above all else. Yet, it wasn't the luxury of the estate that kept him awake at night. It wasn't the vast fields or the grand home that filled him with restless desire. It was Clara. She was a young enslaved woman, strong and beautiful, with dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets of a world Thomas Jr. could never fully understand. She had worked in the house for years, her graceful movements always catching his eye, though he could never act on the attraction that had begun to burn in him. The very thought of it filled him with guilt and shame. His family would never accept a relationship with someone like Clara, a woman who was bound by the color of her skin and the chains that held her in servitude. Yet, every time Thomas Jr. saw her, something inside him stirred. Her quiet strength, her beauty, the way she moved through the world with a grace that defied the brutality of her circumstances. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't ignore her. And for the first time in his life, he found himself questioning the world he had been raised in, questioning the very values that had been instilled in him since birth. Their first real conversation had been brief, a passing moment in the hallway when their eyes had met for the first time. She had looked at him with a mixture of recognition and caution, as if she knew the dangers of looking too long, of letting the moment linger. But Thomas Jr. couldn't look away. "Good morning, Miss Clara," he had said, his voice soft, barely above a whisper. She had nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Good morning, Master Thomas." Her words were polite, restrained, but there was something in the way she said his name that sent a shiver down his spine. It was in that moment that Thomas Jr. understood that the connection between them went beyond mere physical attraction. It was something deeper, something that had been growing in him for months, something he could no longer ignore. But he also understood that it was a connection that could destroy everything. He spent the next few weeks watching her from afar, unable to stop himself from seeking out her presence, even in the most mundane moments. He would find excuses to pass through the halls, to stand just outside the kitchen, to catch a glimpse of her as she worked. One evening, after the dinner bell had rung and most of the staff had retreated to their quarters, Thomas Jr. found himself standing outside Clara's quarters. He had no reason to be there, no excuse to justify his presence, but the pull he felt was undeniable. His hand trembled as he reached for the door, but before he could knock, Clara appeared at the threshold, her eyes wide with surprise. "Master Thomas," she said, her voice a quiet whisper, though there was no mistaking the concern in her eyes. "Is something the matter?" Thomas Jr. hesitated, unsure of what to say. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of his desire pressing against the barrier of his upbringing. I just wanted to see how you're doing," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Clara's gaze softened, but she quickly looked away, her posture stiffening. "I'm doing fine, Master Thomas. You should not be here." Her words were polite, but there was an edge to them, a warning that cut through the air like a blade. But Thomas Jr. couldn't move, couldn't leave. His gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time, the world outside them seemed to disappear. I know it's wrong," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But I can't stop thinking about you." Clara's expression hardened, and she stepped back, her hand falling to the door. "You must leave, Master Thomas. You know what will happen if anyone finds out." Her words were a sharp reminder of the reality that separated them, but Thomas Jr. couldn't tear himself away. His desire for her, his need for her was too powerful to ignore. "I don't care about the consequences anymore," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I can't live in a world where I don't even know what it's like to be with you, to truly be with you." Clara's eyes filled with a quiet sadness, and she took a step back, her gaze shifting to the floor. "You don't understand, Master Thomas. You can't." She closed the door softly between them, leaving him standing in the hallway, his heart racing, his mind consumed by the impossible choice he now faced. The days following that brief, charged encounter left Thomas Jr. in a state of turmoil, his mind spinning with the weight of his emotions and the unbearable tension between him and Clara. The world around him continued, as it always had, overseers cracking their whips, workers bending beneath the weight of their labor, and the plantation running like a well-oiled machine. But Thomas Jr. could no longer see the estate in the same way. Every corner, every face, was now marked by the knowledge of the secret bond that was slowly, painfully, developing between him and Clara. He couldn't focus on his usual duties. His father's stern instructions about expanding the estate's crop yields seemed distant, as if they belonged to someone else's life. Every time he stepped outside, he was confronted by the reality of his situation. His world had always been one of privilege, of wealth and status, but now it felt hollow. The ideals that had been ingrained in him about ownership, about power, seemed like chains, just as cruel and inescapable as those that bound the people he had been taught to treat as nothing more than property. The moments he shared with Clara, however brief, consumed his thoughts. Her dark eyes haunted him. Her quiet strength, the grace with which she moved, and the unmistakable sadness in her gaze left him wondering if she ever thought of him the way he thought of her. Did she feel the same pull between them? Did she understand that their connection was more than physical, more than a fleeting desire? Or was she, as he had always been told, nothing but a servant, a body meant to serve, to endure? As the days passed, Thomas Jr. found himself seeking her out more and more. His walks around the estate had taken on new meaning. He would find excuses to be near the house where Clara worked, standing just outside the windows of the kitchen or the gardens, hoping for a glimpse of her. But he could never quite summon the courage to speak to her again, not without risking everything. One evening, after a long day spent listening to his father talk of future investments and expanding the family business, Thomas Jr. found himself outside the stables once again. But this time, He didn't just pass by. He waited. He waited for her. Clara, as if guided by some invisible force, appeared from the shadows of the plantation's outer walls. Her movements were graceful, almost hesitant, as she made her way toward the gardens. When she saw him, she froze. For a moment, the world between them seemed to stop entirely. Their gazes met, and the air between them grew thick, charged with the silent exchange of emotions they could never openly discuss. "Master Thomas," she said quietly, her voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "I told you, you shouldn't be here." "I know," he replied, his voice low and full of regret. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Clara. I can't pretend like this isn't happening." Clara took a step back, her eyes wide with concern. "You don't understand what you're saying. If anyone sees us, if anyone finds out, I don't care anymore." He interrupted, his voice rising with quiet defiance. "I can't live my life the way they want me to. I can't keep living like everything is okay when I know the truth. You're not just a slave to me, Clara. You're a person, a woman. And I won't pretend otherwise anymore." Clara stood still, her heart racing, her breath caught in her throat. She had never known such words could be spoken to her, let alone from a man like Thomas Jr. Her world had been built on silence, on submission, on the unquestioning acceptance of her place in this cruel system. But Thomas's words shattered that world, offering something she had never dared to dream of, a future where she was seen, where she was valued. You don't understand," she whispered, shaking her head. "You can't just change everything. You can't just say the things you're saying without understanding what it will cost you." "Then let me understand, Clara," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. I want to know everything, what it's like for you, for all of you. I want to know your pain, your heartache, your fear. But most of all, I want to know you. Truly know you." Clara swallowed hard, feeling the tears prick her eyes. She had been trained her entire life to keep her emotions in check, to suppress any desire for something more. Yet, here was Thomas Jr., asking her to do the unthinkable, to open her heart, to share her world. A world that had been made dark by the very people who had enslaved her. She took a step forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I can't give you what you want. I can't give you my heart or my soul, Master Thomas. I'm not allowed to love you. I'm not allowed to dream of a life like yours. I've been taught from the day I was born that I'm nothing. I can't be what you want me to be." Asland. Thomas Jr. reached out and gently took her hand, a tender gesture that sent a shock of warmth through her. "You don't have to be what I want, Clara. You just have to be yourself. I don't care about your status. I don't care about the world they've made for you. I care about you. And I don't want to keep pretending that I don't." The words hung in the air like a promise, but Clara knew the truth. She knew that to act on this love, this forbidden love, would mean risking everything. If they were caught, she would be punished. Worse, she might be sold to another plantation. And Thomas Jr., the man she had come to love with all her heart, would be torn from her forever. "I can't," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't risk everything for something that isn't real. You're the son of the master. You belong to this place. You can't love someone like me. It's impossible." For a moment, they stood in silence, the distance between them, both physical and emotional. The night stretched on, the stars above bearing witness to the quiet pain of two people who had found something precious and doomed by the world around them. "I'm sorry," Thomas Jr. said finally, his voice filled with sorrow. "But I can't let you go. Not now. Not after everything I've seen, everything I've felt. I'll find a way to change this. I will." Clara pulled her hand away, turning her face toward the shadows of the estate. "You're asking for too much," she said softly, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their love, however real, was doomed from the start. "I don't care," Thomas Jr. replied firmly. "I'll do anything. I'll fight for you, Clara. I'll fight for us." The weeks that followed that fateful night were a blur of whispered promises, stolen glances, and the heavy burden of an impossible love. Thomas Jr. found himself caught between two worlds, the life his family had carefully crafted for him, and the forbidden, secret life he dreamed of with Clara. but the weight of his family's expectations bore down on him with every passing day. The plantation was still in need of expansion. His father's business dealings required his attention, and the societal pressure to marry well to preserve the family name was a constant reminder that duty came before personal desires. Despite the unspoken promises made in the quiet of the starlit night, Thomas Jr. could not escape the reality of his position. Margaret, ever watchful and calculating, began to take note of her son's increasingly distracted behavior. Her sharp eyes, accustomed to reading the subtle changes in his demeanor, quickly grew suspicious. She had always prided herself on controlling the estate, keeping her family's affairs in line, and making sure that Thomas Jr. remained a dutiful heir. But there was something different about him now, a restlessness that she couldn't ignore. "You've been acting strange, Thomas," Margaret remarked one afternoon, her eyes narrowing as she watched her son. They were seated in the drawing room, the grand windows overlooking the vast plantation. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only noise that filled the air. "You're distracted, as if your mind is elsewhere." Thomas Jr. stiffened, his gaze moving briefly to the windows before returning to his mother. He knew what she was implying, but he couldn't bring himself to lie about the truth. He couldn't tell her that his thoughts had been consumed by Clara, by the woman he loved and couldn't have. He couldn't tell her that the life he was leading felt more like a prison with each passing day. "I've just been busy, Mother," he replied, his voice smooth but strained. He tried to keep the lie from sounding too obvious, but Margaret wasn't easily fooled. She studied him with a calculating gaze, her suspicion growing. "It's more than just that, Thomas. I've seen the way you look at the slaves. I've seen you watching them. Is there something you want to tell me?" Thomas Jr.'s blood ran cold. His heart raced in his chest, but he held his composure. Margaret had a way of picking apart his every thought, and the guilt that gnawed at him was becoming harder to hide. He didn't want to betray Clara, and he certainly didn't want to betray the only family he had ever known. But as Margaret's eyes bore into him, he realized that the life he had built, his role as the heir to the estate, his position in society, was slipping through his fingers. "I don't know what you mean, Mother," Thomas Jr. said, the words falling from his lips like a well-rehearsed excuse. But even he knew it wasn't enough. Margaret's eyes darkened, her lips thinning into a hard line. "I won't tolerate any more of your nonsense, Thomas," she said sharply. "I've worked too hard to ensure that you take your place as head of this plantation. You are not to fall in love with one of those people." She said the word with such venom that it left a bitter taste in the air. "You are a Harrington. You will marry as a Harrington, and you will not forget your place in this world." Thomas Jr.'s chest tightened. The words stung, but he held his ground. "I don't need you to tell me my place," he said quietly. But the challenge was clear in his voice. Margaret's eyes flashed with fury. She stood abruptly, the sharp click of her heels echoing in the silence between them. "You will marry, and you will do your duty. That is the only choice you have left." With that, she stormed out of the room, leaving Thomas Jr. alone with the weight of her words hanging in the air. He stood there, his thoughts a chaotic storm of frustration and guilt. His mother's control, his father's expectations, they were all pushing him into a life that didn't belong to him. But the pull of Clara, the love he had for her, was far stronger than anything his family could impose. Later that evening, as the estate quieted and the servants finished their work, Thomas Jr. found himself once again walking the familiar path toward Clara's quarters. The weight of his mother's words still pressed on him, but his love for Clara had become his only truth. It had become the one thing he could not deny, no matter the cost. Clara was waiting for him, her face soft with concern but lit by a quiet strength. She had heard of Margaret's suspicions and knew the risks that came with their secret meetings. But every time she saw Thomas, her heart ached with both hope and fear. She loved him, but the consequences of their love were far more than she could bear. "You shouldn't be here, Master Thomas," she said softly, her voice a whisper of warning. "This is too dangerous." "I don't care anymore," he replied, stepping closer to her, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I'm not going to pretend any longer. I don't care about what my family wants, about what they think I should do. I care about you, Clara. Only you." Clara's heart fluttered, but a heavy sadness settled in her chest. She had seen his pain, felt it in the way he looked at her. But she knew better than to dream of a life together. Their love, as powerful as it was, could never exist in the world they had been born into. "You can't just throw it all away," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of reality. "You can't just abandon your family, your future, for me. It's too much." Thomas Jr. shook his head, his hands gently cupping her face. "I don't care about my future. If it's one where I'm not with you, I'll give everything up if it means we can be together. I love you, Clara." The words hung between them, suspended in the air, and Clara closed her eyes, unable to hold back the tears that had threatened for so long. She wanted to believe in his words, wanted to believe in their love, but the truth was too harsh. The world they lived in would never allow it. "You don't understand," she whispered, pulling away slightly, her voice filled with sorrow. "I am nothing. I can never be what you need. Your family will never accept me. I am nothing more than a slave, and that's all I will ever be." Thomas Jr. took her hands in his heart aching with the truth of her words. "Then we'll change that," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "I'll change it. I'll free you, Clara. I swear it." But deep down, he knew that even if he freed her, if they ran together, it wouldn't be enough. The world was unforgiving, and they would always be hunted. Their love was a crime, and the price they would pay for it could never be fully understood. And so, standing in the quiet of the night, with the wind rustling through the trees, Thomas Jr. made a vow. He would betray his family, his inheritance, everything that had been promised to him, for the woman he loved. He would give up everything for Clara, no matter what it cost him. But little did he know, the consequences of this betrayal would not just tear apart his life, it would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything for them both. The family he had known would never be the same, and neither would he. The days following Thomas Jr.'s decision were filled with a strange, suffocating mixture of relief and anxiety. He had finally made up his mind. He could no longer be a part of a world that condemned Clara to a life of suffering. He would free her, and together they would escape the plantation and the chains of his family's legacy. But even as he held on to this fragile hope, the weight of the consequences began to settle over him. Every time he walked through the grand halls of the Harrington estate, he felt the walls closing in around him. The plantation, once a symbol of power and control, now felt like a prison. The faces of the overseers, the other workers, the ones he had once believed to be inferior each time he saw them, he was reminded that they were not just victims of the system, but active participants in it. And now, by loving Clara, he was no longer separate from their world. He was part of the system he had been born into, and he would have to tear it all down to be free. Thomas Jr. met Clara in the dead of night, as they had grown accustomed to doing. The estate was silent. The only sounds, the whispers of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant calls of night birds. Clara was waiting for him by the stables, her face shadowed in the moonlight. Her presence was a balm to his aching heart, but the fear that lingered in her eyes told him that she had not yet fully accepted what he had chosen to do. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice strained. Her body was tense, and she looked over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "I had to see you," Thomas Jr. replied, his words soft but firm. He stepped closer to her, the heat of their bodies mingling in the cool night air. "We don't have much time. I've made up my mind, Clara. I'm going to take you away from here." Clara took a step back, shaking her head as if trying to deny the reality of his words. "You can't just leave everything behind," she said, her voice trembling with worry. "You'll be hunted. They'll never let you go. Your father, he'll—" "I don't care," Thomas Jr. interrupted, his voice rising with a mixture of frustration and desperation. "I don't care about my father, or the estate, or the legacy I'm supposed to uphold. All I care about is you. I'll leave it all behind for you, Clara." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sorrow. "But where will we go? We don't have money. We don't have any way of surviving." Thomas Jr. reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle of coins he had been saving. "I've got enough for us to make it. We'll find a way. I'll get us to the north, where there's freedom. I swear, Clara." I'll do whatever it takes. Clara's gaze softened, but the doubt in her eyes remained. You don't know what you're asking. The world we live in, it's not like the stories of freedom you've heard. It's a dangerous road, Thomas. The law, the bounty hunters, they won't stop. They'll come after us. I don't care if they do, Thomas Jr. said, his voice low but filled with conviction. I'm willing to risk everything for you. We'll be together, no matter the cost. Clara hesitated, her heart torn between the deep love she felt for him and the deep fear of what that love might cost them both. She had always been taught to live within the boundaries of the world that had been set for her, never to dream of something greater, something free. But here, standing before her, was a man who was willing to break every rule, to defy everything his family had ever stood for the chance to love her. Promise me something, Clara said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. What? Thomas Jr. asked, his gaze fixed on her, his heart racing. Promise me that we won't turn back, she whispered, her eyes never leaving his. That no matter what happens, we'll keep going. We won't let fear stop us. If we're going to do this, we do it together no matter what. I promise, Thomas Jr. said without hesitation, taking her hand in his and squeezing it tightly. We won't turn back. We're free, Clara. We'll be free. But as the words left his lips, a chilling thought crossed his mind. He had no idea how long he could keep up the charade, how long he could stay hidden from the family, from the estate, and though he was ready to break away, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. There would be no easy escape from the chains that had bound him, nor would the life they dreamed of be given freely. Later that week, the cracks in Thomas Jr.'s resolve began to show. His father, Thomas Sr., arrived back at the plantation after several weeks of business dealings, his stern presence a reminder of the empire he had built. Margaret, ever vigilant, began to notice the subtle shifts in her son's behavior. The late nights, the preoccupation, the avoidance of her gaze. She was quick to suspect that something was amiss. You've been acting strangely, Margaret said one evening, her tone sharp as she sat across from Thomas Jr. at dinner. What is it, Thomas? What's going on with you? Thomas Jr. met her gaze, his stomach twisting with the guilt of his actions. He couldn't lie to her anymore, not fully. I've been thinking, Mother, he said, his voice steady but quiet. I've been thinking about what kind of man I want to be. Margaret's expression tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. And what kind of man do you want to be, Thomas? A man who stands for what's right, he said, his heart racing. A man who follows his own conscience, not just the expectations of his family. Margaret's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer. You think you can choose your own path, do you? She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. You think you can betray your own family and walk away without consequence? Thomas Jr. swallowed, his throat dry. I'm not betraying anyone. I'm choosing the life I want. I'm not going to live in the shadows anymore. Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. You'll regret this, Thomas. You'll regret turning your back on everything we've built. You'll regret thinking you can do whatever you want. Her words stung, but Thomas Jr. didn't flinch. He had made his decision. The love he felt for Clara, the life they could have, was worth everything. The world he had been born into, his family, the plantation couldn't hold him back anymore. I won't regret it, Mother, Thomas Jr. said quietly. I'm not afraid anymore. Later that night, as Thomas Jr. lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, he knew there was no going back. The price of his betrayal had already been set into motion. Margaret, his father, the entire plantation, they would all come for him, and for Clara. The chase would begin soon, but Thomas Jr. didn't care. He would face whatever consequences awaited him, for the woman he loved, for the life he had chosen. The days following Thomas Jr.'s confrontation with his mother were filled with both anticipation and dread. Each passing hour felt like an eternity, the walls of the mansion closing in on him as the tension between him and his family escalated. Though he had made his decision to escape, a part of him still questioned whether he was doing the right thing. Could he truly abandon everything he had been raised to believe? Was love really enough to risk his life, his future, and his family's wrath? The answer, Thomas Jr. knew, was yes. But as he stole moments with Clara, every second spent together felt like a countdown to their inevitable flight. She was preparing to leave with him, fearful, hopeful, yet uncertain of what awaited them. The risks were unimaginable. Freedom would not come easily. The night they were to escape, the moon was full and the air was thick with humidity. The plan had been set into motion weeks earlier, but now, as Thomas Jr. approached Clara's quarters, he could feel the weight of their choices press upon him. Clara stood by the door, her face shadowed by the dim lantern light. Her heart pounded in her chest as she saw him. Despite their shared love, there was no denying the fear that gripped her, fear not only for their future, but for the consequences that would surely follow. "You're sure?" Clara asked, her voice low but filled with the kind of fear that only comes when one's life is about to change forever. Thomas Jr. nodded, his own resolve hardening. "I'm sure. We leave tonight." Her gaze softened, a tear slipping from the corner of her eye. She reached for his hand, their fingers interlocking tightly. "And you're sure about me? About us? You know what this will cost you." "I'm sure," Thomas Jr. replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing else matters but you." He had told her he was ready to leave everything behind, but Clara knew that the price of their love would stretch far beyond their escape. She had always known the cost of disobedience, the cost of dreaming for something greater. "There's no turning back now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we leave, they'll hunt us down. The law will be against us. The plantation will come after us. They'll never forgive you." Thomas Jr. squeezed her hand, determination radiating from him. "I don't care. We're together. We'll fight." As they moved silently through the mansion's shadowed halls, Thomas Jr. led Clara toward the hidden door in the rear of the house. It had taken weeks of careful planning, but now it was time. Every detail had been accounted for: food, money, and a guide to take them to the nearest station of the Underground Railroad. Yet, even with the plans in place, the fear of being caught lurked in the back of his mind. They reached the back gate, where a small carriage awaited them. But just as they began to step into the carriage, the sound of heavy footsteps reached their ears. "Thomas." A voice, cold and full of authority, echoed through the night air. It was his father, Thomas Sr. Thomas Jr.'s heart stopped. He turned, his body freezing in place. There, standing at the gate, was his father, his face stern, the shadows casting a sharp line across his features. Behind him stood several of the overseers, their eyes filled with suspicion. "You've made a mistake, Thomas," his father said, his voice a low growl. "A mistake that will cost you everything." Clara gasped, her body trembling with fear. Thomas Jr. didn't move, didn't speak. The weight of his father's words echoed in his mind, but he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. He had chosen his path, and he would not turn back. "You know what will happen if you try to leave," Thomas Sr. continued, his voice cold, cutting through the silence. "The law is on my side. You'll never escape." Thomas Jr. finally stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with quiet fury. "I don't care about the law, Father. I'm not your puppet anymore. I'm not going to live my life in your shadow, doing what you want me to. I'm leaving with Clara, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." A sharp silence filled the air as Thomas Sr. took a step closer, his face twisting with rage. The overseers behind him shifted uneasily, as if unsure of how to react. "You will regret this, Thomas," his father spat. "You think you can defy everything we've built? You think you can just walk away from your birthright, from your duty to this plantation, to this family?" "I've already made my choice," Thomas Jr. said, his voice unwavering. "And I'm not going to live my life in chains. Not any longer." So, the tension between father and son hung heavy in the air. For a moment, it seemed like they might come to blows. But then, Thomas Jr. took Clara's hand once more and turned toward the carriage. "Let's go," he whispered to her, his eyes full of resolve. But just as they started to move, Thomas Sr. stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "You won't get far. If you think you can leave, you'll regret it. I will hunt you down. The law will hunt you down. And you will be nothing more than a fugitive." Thomas Jr. stopped, his back stiff with defiance. "Then let it be that way," he said, his voice low and final. "I'll never be part of this world again. You've already lost me." With that, he and Clara climbed into the carriage, the horses pulling them into the night, away from the plantation, away from the life Thomas Jr. had known. But as the wheels of the carriage turned, Thomas Jr. couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger, but the future, his future, was his own to claim. Behind them, the Harrington estate loomed, silent and foreboding in the distance. For Thomas Jr., it represented the world he was leaving behind, the world that had shaped him, that had taught him to believe in power, in wealth, in control. But now, that world felt empty, hollow, and he was determined to break free. As the miles passed, the feeling of freedom swelled in his chest. He looked over at Clara, who sat beside him, her hand still tightly clutched in his. "We're free," he whispered, his heart filled with quiet joy. "We're free." But even as he spoke the words, the shadows of their escape loomed large. They had taken the first step toward a life they had dreamed of, but the journey ahead would be fraught with peril. The plantation, the law, and his father's wrath would be on their heels, hunting them down. There would be no peace, no safety, until they reached the north, until they found freedom. But in that moment, as they drove deeper into the unknown, Thomas Jr. held on to one simple truth. He would never turn back. The night air was cool against Thomas Jr. and Clara's faces as they traveled further from the plantation, each mile stretching farther between them and the world they had left behind. The wheels of the carriage creaked in rhythm with their hearts, both racing with the same blend of fear and anticipation. The darkness around them was vast, the thick trees and shadows of the landscape concealing them, yet offering little comfort. Every flicker of sound, every rustling leaf, set their nerves on edge. For the first time, Thomas Jr. felt the weight of what they were doing. He had left behind everything, the estate, his inheritance, his family, and for what? Clara's hand in his. A hope, a dream, the promise of freedom. He had told himself he was ready, that he could face whatever came. But the fear that had once been a distant, nagging feeling now gripped his chest with its icy fingers. As they ventured deeper into the wilderness, the moonlight flickered through the canopy of trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Clara sat beside him, her face pale but filled with the quiet strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. Her hand was firmly in his, but he could feel the tremor in her touch. The night was only beginning, and they both knew the journey ahead would be fraught with danger. "Do you think we'll make it?" Clara asked softly, her voice breaking through the silence of the night. Thomas Jr. glanced at her, his expression filled with determination, but also the weight of uncertainty. "We'll make it. We have to. For you. For us." But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his mind. They were two fugitives in a world that would never allow them to simply walk away. They had to make it to the north, to freedom, to the Underground Railroad, but that journey would not be easy. The law, the bounty hunters, and the plantation's reach were long. They had already made their break, but now they were on the run, and they could never stop. Hours passed as they made their way through the dense forest, the sound of the carriage wheels cutting through the still night air. The journey was long, and every crackling twig or distant sound of horses made their hearts race. Clara's eyes darted nervously around them, ever watchful. Her mind was filled with the possibility of being discovered. She had known this life, the life of servitude, and now, in a way, she had to navigate a world of escape that was far more dangerous. "I can't stop thinking about them," Clara whispered, her voice tinged with sorrow. "My people, my family, I left them behind." Thomas Jr. tightened his grip on her hand. "We'll come back for them, Clara. Once we're free, we'll come back for everyone we can." Her eyes met his, a faint flicker of hope in their depths. But there was something else too, a deep sadness that would never go away. The world they were born into, the family they had left behind, could never be fully erased. They would always carry the weight of that life, no matter where they went. The moon rose higher, casting silver light on the road ahead. but the shadows of their escape followed closely behind. Every mile they traveled, Thomas Jr. felt the pressure mount. He knew that if they were caught, everything would be lost. There would be no going back, no forgiveness. But that was a risk he had chosen to take. He would not lose Clara, not after everything they had already fought for. Suddenly, the sound of galloping hooves reached their ears. The sharp beat of the horses' hooves on the dirt path pierced the silence of the night. Thomas Jr. froze, his heart leaping into his throat. "Clara, stay down," he hissed. "Quiet." The carriage slowed as Thomas Jr. urged the horses to stop. He glanced at Clara, her face pale in the moonlight. The fear in her eyes mirrored his own. He knew the danger. They had been pursued for hours, but now the real chase had begun. Through the trees, Thomas Jr. could see the outline of several riders approaching. Their silhouettes were dark against the night sky, but there was no mistaking the determination in their movements. They were bounty hunters, hired by his father or the plantation's overseers to track him down. He had known this would come, but now that it was here, his blood ran cold. He pulled the reins tighter, urging the horses to move slowly, silently. Clara gripped his hand harder, her breath shallow and quick. "Go," Thomas Jr. whispered urgently. "Now, head for the river. We can lose them there." With no time to think, he whipped the reins, urging the horses forward. The sound of the riders' pursuit grew louder, the thundering of hooves echoing through the trees. Thomas Jr. dared a glance back. He could see them now, their faces illuminated by the faint light of the moon. They were closing in. "Hold on," he muttered, his voice tight with fear. "We have to make it." The horses galloped forward, the wheels of the carriage creaking as it sped along the uneven path. Thomas Jr.'s pulse quickened as he heard the riders gaining on them. His mind raced, calculating their escape route. The river lay just ahead. If they could make it, they might be able to cross to the other side and lose the hunters, but the riders were relentless. Thomas Jr. felt his heart sink as one of the men shouted in the distance, his voice cutting through the night. "There they are! Cut them off!" In that moment, everything seemed to slow. Thomas Jr. could hear the pounding hooves growing louder, see the faint flicker of torches in the distance. The river was close, but would they make it in time? "Clara," Thomas Jr. called, his voice strained. "Stay low, keep quiet." But before she could respond, the carriage was rocked violently as one of the riders charged from the side, blocking their path. Thomas Jr. jerked the reins, trying to steer the horses, but it was too late. The horses screamed in panic as the men closed in on them. The carriage lurched to a halt. The riders surrounded them, their torches casting long shadows on the ground. Thomas Jr.'s heart pounded in his chest as he saw the men dismount, their eyes filled with malice. He had known this moment would come, but nothing could prepare him for the cold reality of it. "Get out of the carriage," one of the men barked. "You're coming with us." Thomas Jr. looked at Clara, her eyes wide with fear. He knew this was it. They had been caught. But in that moment, his resolve hardened. He would not give up. He would not let Clara be dragged back to that hell. "I won't go back," he said, his voice steady but filled with defiance. "You'll have to kill me first." The men laughed, stepping closer. But Thomas Jr. had already made up his mind. With one swift motion, he grabbed the small pistol hidden beneath his coat. "Stay down," he said to Clara, his eyes fierce. "I won't let them take us." The sound of gunfire echoed through the night, the world around them blurring in chaos. It wasn't over yet, but their fight had only just begun.